Un quick sound check. Karen, ¿me escuchan?
Escucho.
¿Y tú?
Hay que mover a la gente, hay que mover a
Vamos ahora.
networking para acá.
Está bien, estamos bien. 5:45, ahora mismo les avisamos ya. We have 20 here. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We have 60 people that are in the event. 22 are here in sessions. Maybe they're still networking, so we're going to give them a couple minutes. Welcome, everyone. Carmen. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone. As you come in, can you let me know if you can hear me loud and clear? You want to check sound, Sophia?
Hello. ¿Me escucho? Hi, everyone.
You sound great. We have people still coming back. No, not yet. Adriana, we're here. Don't worry. As they come in, I'm going to do a couple of quick announcements. Any new info, Sophia, by the way, from the executive order? Just wondering.
I think the most important thing is 25% closed on restaurants and malls. But other than that, it doesn't seem too different.
Okay.
I didn't watch the entire thing, but
Right.
that's what I could gather.
That's good to know. The day has been that hectic that I had no clue that there was a message today. All right. Right now, we have 34. Let's keep bringing them over. Can everybody hear us here in session? No, don't worry, Adriana, Cieda, the rest of the people here. For right now, we're gonna let the speaker go ahead and start when we start the presentation. And after she's done, then we're gonna do a Q&A and allow everybody to hop in, as many as you want, okay? So for right now, do not worry, you're here. You can listen to us, right? Can everybody hear us? So no worries. We're all good. For right now, everybody can stay on chat, listen to us well. Just make sure that everything's working well with for you. Once we're done for the Q&A, we do want you to hop in. We want you to participate actively and in person, if you wish. So that's the cool thing about hopping. You can work as smoothly and as tightly as you want. All right, you tell me, Sophia, Karen, do you want to get ahead? Right?
Let's go ahead. Sure.
Well, welcome everybody to Tech Guru Talks. This is Tech Talk number 2. Let's talk tech, right?
That's right.
We have a great show for you tonight. My name is Angie Torre from Seriously Creative. We have been asked to help put this together and MC it. We've been working with Hopin as facilitators that we are in design thinking and doing these brainstormings with all of these post-its. So we came across this cool platform called Hopin, which allows people to not necessarily be tight on the camera all the time, but you can navigate and go between rooms and breakouts as you wish. So, and also it has that cool networking feature as well as a cool expo, and you can have booths and stuff like that. So we hope that you enjoy it and enjoy our talk tonight. With regards to a couple of technical things that I would like to remind you about Hopin or let you know about Hopin is number one, you decide what screen you want to watch. So you can go ahead and double click on the screen when the presenter is actually presenting. You can double click on her slides and they'll come up bigger in your screen. Also, there's like on where the time left is playing on the top that says 2 hours and 21 minutes. There's like a little arrow right there. And if you hit that arrow, it will close the chat feature for you so that your screen's bigger if you want to see it bigger. So that's another cool thing. What else? When you do hop in, and I'll let you know this when we go into the Q&A, do mute yourself, because that's one thing that's different from Zoom that I cannot go ahead and turn off your mic. You need to do that for us. You can participate lightly on the chat. I'd love to hear your insights during the talk. So go ahead and use the chat to, record any highlights that you have from the things that you're listening to. Also, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and use the chat further. We'll be monitoring and using that for Q&A. Again, thanks to Piloto and Evertech for the invitation to be part of this. I'm learning a lot. So I'm going to head it out to Sofia.
Hi everyone, hola a todos. Mi nombre es Sofía Stolberg. Yo soy una de las fundadoras de Piloto 151. Tenemos una audiencia mixta, así es que cambiaré a inglés también. Pero el propósito de Tech Guru Talks, cuando nos acercamos a Evertech, realmente era crear un espacio y un foro para que... crear un espacio y un foro. Perdonen un momento, estamos en cuarentena todavía y se nota.
Pero que salude, Sofía. la mini-me, una de las mini-mes.
Así mismo. Pues el propósito realmente de Tech Guru Talks, sacamos a Evertech, fue crear un foro y un espacio para que la comunidad de tecnología en Puerto Rico también pudiese acceder a speakers internacionales que pudiesen hablar en más profundidad sobre tecnología, que fuese un poquito más techy que las charlas tradicionales que hay en nuestro ecosistema. Y los que viven en Puerto Rico saben que nuestro ecosistema ha crecido muchísimo en los últimos años, que tenemos todo tipo de evento empresarial en todas las áreas posibles. Y realmente esta serie viene a llenar un poco ese vacío de tratar de lograr que las charlas sean un poquito más enfocadas en tecnología para que la comunidad de desarrolladores y de tech en Puerto Rico y en Latinoamérica siga creciendo. Así es que estamos muy contentos de que esta es la segunda charla y le damos la bienvenida a Karen Serra de Evertech, que junto a su equipo apostó a esta serie para que pueda introducir a nuestra oradora en la noche de hoy. Karen.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es Karen Serra, como dijo Sofía, yo trabajo como especialista de innovación en Evertech. Les quiero dar, igual que Angie y Sofía, la bienvenida a nuestra segunda sesión de Tech Guru Talks. Como muy bien dijeron, esto es para ustedes, para la comunidad de Puerto Rico y Latinoamérica, esa comunidad tech que, pues a pesar de la situación que vivimos, queríamos tener este espacio donde puedan conectar, usar una plataforma que fuese interactiva, que fuese tipo evento, en vez de tipo pues, llamada o charla. Y nuestra intención es abrir el apetito a que quieran aprender, a que quieran conocer, a que quieran interactuar. La facilitadora de hoy se llama Lorena Mesa. Ella es politóloga convertida en programadora. Lorena es ingeniera de datos en el equipo de sistemas de inteligencia de software de GitHub, directora y presidenta de la Python Software Foundation y coorganizadora de Pi Ladies en Chicago. Su lema de vida es vivir mucho, prosperar y Python. Y con esto le dejo ya la cámara y el micrófono a Lorena.
Lorena, puedes subir cuando gustes. You can wow!
¡Hola!
Lorena de la show this afternoon. What?
Hola, mis amores, ¿cómo están?
You look great. Lorena, let me introduce to you. Here's Karen, Sofia. Dana Montenegro is the creative of Seriously Creative. He's my husband. He's also my husband and father of my children. So Lorena, welcome. Thanks for being here. You look great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today.
All right, Lorena, if you want, we can start, we can talk while you go ahead and share slowly. Just Dana, is everything okay at the house? Just checking. Okay, good.
Nothing is burnt down yet.
Okay, good. All right. Well, guys, you know how this goes. Again, let me do the quick household announcements. You decide what you want to watch. We're going to go offline to not bother Lorena and leave her to her slides. But if you want to see her slides bigger, you can go ahead and double click on the slides. Also, make sure on the right-hand side on the top, next to the time, if you click on that and close the chat, you can see the whole screen a lot bigger. Use the chat also to let us know any insights, any main insights that you hear during her talk, as well as questions. We want you to have questions by the time she finishes. When she's done, do not hesitate to hop in the screen. You can do that by clicking on the right, I think it's on the right top for most people. It's a button that says a join or, all you have to do is click on the blue button and we'll let you in. So with that said, Karen, bye. You can go ahead and leave. And Sofia, we're all out because this is Lorena's show, not ours. And I'm going to apply that to myself and go off camera. Lorena, quick check again.
Hola.
I have a small crush on you. You look amazing. So I'm just going to go off camera.
Here's the secret. Use a DSLR as your web camera and then you look fabulosa. Yeah, I can show you how to do that with open source. So like,
Okay,
like a lightning talk after this, yeah? Okay. All right. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Lorena Mesa y hoy estoy hablando en inglés, pero estoy tan feliz de estar aquí. And when we get to like Q&A, podemos hacer uno poquito de like Spanglish si quieres, but I'm going to be doing this talk in English. And again, feel free, if you have any audio issues, please feel free, put some chat. I'll try to keep an eye on that as I go along. And as you may see on the slides, the title of today's talk is Your Data is Biased. Here's Why: Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning. This talk, actually, all of it, there's a lot of links and a lot of materials if you are interested for continued learning. So definitely do go check out the bit.ly link. I make sure to do copious notes and make sure to link to everything that I talk about. The bit.ly link for this is bit.ly/your data is bias. So let's go ahead and get into it. So as you all may have heard a little bit about my background, not needing to repeat a lot of it, but broadly speaking, I do a lot of work in the Python space. I, with my day job, work as a data engineer at GitHub. I am a huge proponent of something that I call responsible computer science and responsible technology. And actually, that's going to be something I'm going to be getting into a good bit in this talk. If you do have questions and for some reason we don't get to them today here, you can definitely reach out to me on Twitter, Instagram. I have the same obnoxious handle, all of the places, Lorena Nicole. Yeah, that's like 4 O's just to start, because why not? But that's a little bit about me and where you can find me. So outside of technology, though, I've lived a life of many things. I guess you can say I'm a woman of many passions. I study martial arts. You can find me geeking out about Star Trek, particularly cosplaying in Star Trek, and always really being way too excited to tell people I'm learning Klingon. Again, maybe a talk for another time. But like all of you, I'm the product of my own passions, my interests, my family histories, my racial and ethnic backgrounds, all of which amounts to making me me. And a part of something that's very profound about who I am is my hometown. I'm born and raised in Chicago. Chicago, the home of the first skyscraper, which, if you needed to know, is the Home Insurance Building, built in 1884. Home of the first Ferris wheel, the creators of the deep dish pizza. And I'm sorry to tell you, if anyone tells you that Chicagoans eat deep dish, like, they're lying. That's not real. I don't know who does that. Maybe tourists. So no, don't eat deep dish. But I am home from Chicago, and Chicago is profoundly a strong part of who I am. Now, many of you may have heard of Chicago as being known as the Windy City. And why do we have that name, the Windy City? Well, actually, this moniker, the Windy City, is a throwback to a time when Chicago had an aggressive bid to host the 1893 World's Fair, which, yes, Chicago did eventually win. Myth has it that the warning was issued by New York Sun-Times editor Charles Dana in 1890 for readers to ignore the nonsensical claims of that Windy City, explicitly calling out Chicago politicians, saying that they were full of hot air. So while Dana was a popular dissenter of Chicago, and actually those words weren't actually found in print saying that Chicago politicians are full of hot air, it kind of became a little bit more of a myth. But the dislike and disdain of Dana towards Chicago politicians and their aggressive bid for the World's Fair, this was actually something that was very widely known. And the reputation of Chicago as being this city that was really known for politicians that were pretty corrupt, definitely not something that has gone away. So it's interesting if I ask people, like, you know, porque piensas el nickname de Chicago is Windy City, people are like, it's because it's windy, right? I'm like, well, not really. It's not the weather. I think it's a little bit more a little bit of the politics. So Chicago, definitely a city full of many, many histories. But as I mentioned, I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. And I've actually got my family roots come from quite a few places. And I think that's something that many of us in the Latinx community can identify with. My father's family is from Mexico. My mother's family is partly from Cuba and from España. And all of them came to eventually settle in Chicago and stay where I have then since been able to be fortunate enough to call home. And actually, Chicago has such a heavy hand in the origin story of how I became involved in technology. See, in 2009, I graduated from Northwestern University, a university just north of Chicago, with a degree in political science. Circulating around this 2009 was this idea of a movement. And what was this movement? It was a political one, summed up by the phrase, change we can believe in. As a bright, fresh-eyed college grad living in Chicago, I joined this movement and this campaign, working específicamente on the Latino Vote team. Particularly for this 2008 campaign, the role of the internet and the role of emerging technologies were prominently used and were very instrumental to the success of the campaign. Ariana Huffington, editor of Huffington Post, went on the record to go so far as to say that had it not been for the internet, Barack Obama would not be the president. And were it not for the internet, Barack Obama would not have even been the nominee. And why did Ariana Huffington make these bold claims? Well, there's a myriad of reasons. And some of the ways that our campaign actually leaned into using emerging technologies, particularly those that were broadly based on internet services, were such things as our use of social media. Yeah, it's kind of wild to think that only like 10, maybe 11 years ago, being a little squishy here, that there was a world where, you know, we weren't all on YouTube, or we weren't all on Instagram, or heck, we weren't even using cool pieces of technology like Hopin. In fact, all of our Get Out the Vote, GOTV for short, drives were informed by this budding field called data science. And another way that this budding field of data science, we used it for the campaign, was in the development of all these customized fill-in-the-blank groups for Obama. So for example, women for Obama, African Americans for Obama, veterans for Obama, or Latinos for Obama, or Tejanos for Obama, or Chicanos for Obama. I imagine that many of us have probably had that dialogue with some people. You know, some people will say, I don't understand what Latinx means. I don't understand what Chicano means. You know, what's Boricua? Like, why isn't there just one term? And as we all know, the historical complexity of the space that makes up LATAM is a rich fabric. And it is so fundamentally informed by the hyperlocal, but also the narrative of diaspora. So these complex personal groups that were instrumental in building up the campaign base for Obama really spoke to the complexity of identity. And working in the Latino Vote team, specifically, I say Latinx, granted our team was named the Latino Vote team, one way that I always tell this story about kind of the identity and how it was that our campaign had to think about how to do messaging to reach out to people in our key states, as we had 4 key states during the 2008 campaign, including Texas. See, my abuelo's family is from Texas, and they're right from where you see on the map there, right along the border by the Rio Grande. And one of the first things I can remember my abuelo telling me was like, Mija, listen, we did not move. The border moved on us. Never forget the Treaty of 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was actually a treaty that resulted in a large part of Texas, which was formerly part of Mexico, being annexed into the United States. See, in this area of Texas, many may not consider themselves Latinx, but instead maybe Tejano, or, you know, even some folks may identify as Chicano. So, you know, if you're ever thinking about Salenas, always plural, never singular, you know, there's a very strong regional identity there. So for us in thinking about, you know, the nuances of identity, of how to do targeted outreach, thinking about what the Latino vote means in our battleground states, Nevada, Colorado, Texas, Florida, that messaging was hyper informed by the unique parameters on the ground, by the unique histories and legacies that those communities have lived. The Obama for America 2008 campaign was pulling data from many non-traditional sources, like social media, building models to target and interact with their key demographic audiences in new personalized fashions. Some of the skills that were required for us to do this included such things as predictive analytics, answering such questions like, given X turnout, how likely were we to win? How many more people did we need to it to show up on voting day in order to win this precinct, in order to win this voting block, in order to turn this area from red to blue. Another skill set that we had to think about, sentiment analysis. Was our messaging actually on brand? Was it resonating with people? Or, another one to think about, mapping. Where were we best using our assets to meet our key 4 voting states' agendas? These type of problems, which can be solved by data science, draw from so many areas of expertise, such as math and programming. But really, the idea of what data science is not any one of these particular things, but rather the confluence of them all. However, at the time, as literally the sole intern and staffer based out of headquarters in Chicago for the Latino Vote team, I was a political scientist. I was not actually someone who really knew much about programming. And that's actually how I started to become more and more technical as I started my career into what is today now me as an engineer. So the idea of me being someone who got involved in a political campaign that actually required me to have to learn how to program, that actually required me to think about a specific question that was very value driven for me, that identity and that experience has been something that has stayed with me my entire career. See, from the 2008 to 2012 campaign, if we were to look at Chicago during this evolution of this last 10 years, Chicago itself has gone through its own journey. And one of the ways that I can summarize the experience of Chicago, if we were to say, look at the last 40 years of Chicago, unfortunately, the summary that I would make is the wealthy in Chicago continue to get wealthier, whereas the least wealthy continue to lose access to capital. Additionally, the middle class continues to relocate to the suburbs. And as you can visibly see here on this map, the tale of Chicago is one of segregation. What you see in the southwest and west sides of Chicago is predominantly where the Black community resides, whereas there's pockets of the Latinx community. So predominantly Pilsen, for example, which is in the southwest side, that is an area that's more of Mexican heritage, whereas we have a big thriving Puerto Rican community in Humboldt Park in the northwest side. Those pockets, as you can see, kind of align a little bit more on the southwest and northwest sides. But these areas where mostly communities of color reside, in contrast to where the more affluent north side, which is largely white, are, not only is it that the populations themselves are segregated, but additionally, that these are the areas that coincide with food deserts, lack of investment in infrastructure, lack of access to healthcare, and other such disparities. Another thing that's very telling as well is that in areas where there's BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, these are also areas that have higher arrest rates and are subject to heavier policing. So see, in 2017, we had a new mayor, finally, after a long time of a family called the Daley family had been in power for quite some time, with a brief interjection of someone named Harold Washington, who's a fantastic mayor. But in 2017, when we had this change of guard, many people were looking forward to potentially something new. A new mayor, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who actually was former chief of staff under the Obama White House administration. One of the themes that Rahm Emanuel came in on was talking about how he would be focusing on crime. And not only was he going to be focusing on crime reduction, but he was going to be investing heavily in technology to help curtail the rising rates of crime. So how exactly did Rahm propose to use technology to help curtail rise of crime, or just combat crime in general? Well, he was talking about something called predictive policing. And these predictive policing strategies were to be heavily employed in Chicago's South Side. In describing what predictive policing strategies were, some of the tactics that were discussed included such things as identifying people who were expected to become victims or criminals even before a crime happened. Therefore, allegedly, the Chicago Police Department could send officers to potentially go and visit people and warn them against committing said violent crime. Don't know about you, but that sounds a little way too much like sci-fi and not something I want to go into, but these were quite literally techniques and strategies that were being talked about in the Chicago political space about how it is we can use technology to combat crime. Another predictive policing strategy included this idea of a development of a strategic subject list dashboard. So the idea would be that you have, it may be a little grainy, but of the slides, and again, that does link back to a paper that talks about this. You were supposed to have a dashboard that would generate a score of 1 to 500 plus, where an officer could then use this dashboard when pulling someone over, and then use that number that would be associated with a risk of how violent said person was they were pulling over. So for example, if an officer was doing let's say someone had a taillight out and they pulled someone over that was driving their vehicle. In theory, they could use this dashboard, which would generate a numeric score to tell them to what extent this person might be deemed a potential threat. Now, the problem with this is, while the data that was used to generate the score did include information such as past arrest records for violent crime, information on if the person had weapon offenses or narcotic offenses, this score was also generated by connecting the individual arrest records of an individual person with people that were believed to be associates of that person, thereby boosting potentially the score generated on the other side when you start making inferences about if this person is potentially connected to other people. And the way they were potentially connected was through geographic data, zip code specifically. We might be falsely over-asserting the score that indicates that someone is likely to be more violent. This idea of having a dashboard which doesn't allow granularity for a Chicago Police Department officer to actually dig in and understand how the score was generated or why was yet again another example of a problematic idea of predictive policing that could be used and employed in Chicago at large. Not being able to ask the why or the how for the score because it's not easily surfaced and it's kind of there in another dashboard. The problem of how to actually then understand what this tool is doing for you doesn't actually, I would argue, help us get to the root of effectively combating police offense in the community. Now, that's 2017. Also in the backdrop of Chicago in 2017 and 2018, the news publication, The Guardian, published a large expose detailing some of the systematic problems of policing in Chicago, specifically looking at the disappearances of approximately 7,000 people that were held in custody by the Chicago Police Department. It should be no surprise that an overwhelming majority of these individuals were people of color. See, I was actually working on some of the freedom of information requests that was helping to kind of understand what was happening to people and why they were being disappeared for a period of time with the Chicago Justice Project. And part of the work that we were doing was actually asking for data that Chicago Police Department had on folks that were brought in for interrogation and then what happened to them over the course of the time that they were in the custody of the Chicago Police Department. The work that we ended up finding was that what we could infer was that there were specific people that had just spaces of hours where they were not being tracked and essentially were disappeared. And again, the idea of who the people were that were being disappeared and where they were coming from, again, demonstrates the bias of over-policing of people of color, over-policing of people from specific parts of Chicago. So all of this activity through understanding and observing trends within Chicago and trends within how we dialogue about the use of technology in the civic space, in government, just broadly speaking, Chicago as a user of technology and what that looks like, this is just a microcosm. See, predictive policing, as we understand, it's not anything new. This discussion of policing itself and how technology intersects is problematic in many places. We've seen it with Amazon's technology called recognition. And yes, you spell it with a K because we're technologists and we don't like to spell words like they're supposed to be spelled. But with the recognition tool set, which does facial recognition, as early as 2018, when this tool was being brought out in front of the broader public, many organizations, including the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, were calling out the problematic use of facial recognition technology and how it overlabels faces of color as matching potential faces of color in arrest database, so from a mugshot, and also more likely generating a score that this person is more likely to be an offender. So the whole space of predictive policing has been not just within Chicago problematic, or as we've seen with Amazon products itself being problematic and flawed, but it's a place where we very visibly can see that there's a public interest and there's bias. And as if that was not enough, within Chicago, in the middle of 2018, tensions were very high. There was a very, very visible murder trial that had finally begun to start for the murder of Laquan McDonald. See, Laquan McDonald was an unarmed Black teenager who not only was killed by the police, but was shot 16 times and killed. And the video, the dash cam that captured this footage, was suppressed for quite some time by Mayor Rahm Emanuel and led to a lot of tension, as this is a very clear example of a very problematic use of force. So middle of 2018, all of this is happening. Just in the middle of 2018, 2017, we have this dialogue around predictive policing. We have this dialogue around what policing ought to look like when it uses tech. We have this dialogue about The Guardian doing the expose of problematic policing patterns in general. And I just found myself starting to feel lost. See, the organization that I worked for in 2018, I worked at a social media management analytics company. And while we weren't the social media platform, what I did as an engineer was working on a data science team that created models that did more advanced analytics on top of the native social media platforms for our users. It was a software as a service. And the thing that was really hard for me to come to terms with was when I learned about this amicus brief from the ACLU, again, the American Civil Liberties Union, wherein it was found that a partner that was reselling the software of the company that I helped build was actually selling to the Chicago Police Department. And specifically, the ACLU was bringing a lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department for their unconstitutional use of social media software, of social media monitoring and analytics software. Specifically, the amicus brief went in to say how marketing materials specifically targeted law enforcement so as to say, this is how you can follow hashtags like Black Lives Matters, I can't breathe. Going so far as to, again, really put up in front at the center of the work that I was doing, knowing that software I was writing was actually being used potentially to help drive some of these tactics by the Chicago Police Department, which again has had some very questionable, very, very questionable practices. And as someone who likes to think about holding myself accountable for the work that I do, I couldn't help but think of this. This image right here, which I always wish I could find the one where Mark Zuckerberg is on the booster seat, because that's quite hilarious because he had to be seated on a booster seat for this photo. But this right here is a photo of Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, as we know, being called in front of the United States House Intelligence Committee, specifically about Cambridge Analytica, which was a big, as many of you all know, which was a big, big, big discussion about what went wrong with Facebook and how did they allow data from their platform to get downloaded basically illegally and then be used for basically intelligence to target and kind of thwart interests in the 2016 USA presidential campaign. Right here, this image of a technologist being called in front of a regulatory body, being asked, what did you do? Why didn't you do it? What are you going to change? All of those things right there is what I think of when I go back to that moment in 2018, and I thought about reading that ACLU lawsuit. I am a Chicagoan first and foremost. I am very proud to be a Chicagoan. And knowing that technology I was writing, knowing that technology that was paying my bills was potentially going and causing harm to my fellow Chicagoans, that was a really hard place for me to be. And ultimately, what I found I had to do for myself was engage in a dialogue and understand with myself what my values are. Think about, not that tech is neutral, but really what is the impact that tech has? Ultimately, I had to decide what was appropriate for me. And what I ultimately ended up finding out that what my sense of right was unfortunately in direct contrast with my employers at the time. And you know what? With my technical skill sets, I figured I'm able to go many places to find meaningful, gainful employment. And that's what I ended up doing. So it's so strange for me to come back full circle to look at technology. Today, August 19th, tonight, the third night of the Democratic National Convention, Barack Obama is going to be speaking again, former President Barack Obama. And I can't help but think about this journey that my tech career has taken from 2008 to today, where I've continued. I started my technology journey really believing in this movement, si se puede, we can do this, really believing in the vision of this movement of change we can believe in. And then seeing how over time, that idea of what the role of technology is in the world has become a bit more murky for me. So when we think about when we think of or understand the impact of tech that we have in the world, I'm not here to tell you what the answer is for you, but I'm here to instead inspire you to think about the question, how can we do better? So when we think about data, there's a lot of ways we can think about the problems with data, or maybe not even necessarily problems, but the way that the data economy has an impact on what we do as technologists, be it we're the engineers building it, be it we're the consumers, be it we're the designers. We all have some kind of interaction with the data economy that has been generated from technology. And quite literally, the stat right here, I had to think about, like, the first thing right now when I think about data is just the sheer volume of it. Looking for a more recent stat, I actually couldn't, trying to find one that was, scientific-ish, because a lot of people have interesting ways of measuring this. It was interesting because, at generating 2.5 quintillion records of new data daily, which is a stat from March 2018, if we were to compare that to a stat I found in 2012, that was around 2.5 gigabytes of new data generated daily. So if we're thinking about how ways we can understand what bias in data means, we can think about it just from the sheer volume of data that's generated daily. We can think about not only the sheer volume of data, but how is that data generated? What is happening now is we have this movement from active mechanisms of collecting data to increasingly more invisible and passive ones. So what do I mean by that? Think about data collection kind of as two categories. We have active data collection. So for example, responding to a survey. Maybe you bought a service from some kind of software company and they want to know, how did we do? Did you like our product? That's you actively responding to something. Whereas passive data collection are potentially instances where your data is collected without any direct action from the person. So ways we can think about that: web tracking technologies like cookies, GPS data, that's used a lot. Even chatbot data, like if you think about how people ask questions, and a lot of these times, sometimes you might have things like intercom that does some of the like, what's your problem, and tries to help route through customer support. That itself is data collection. to, again, the idea of social media monitoring and listening, I've shared my example and kind of interaction with that, to other passive measurements, such as smart devices like Fitbit, and I am very guilty of it. I wear Fitbit all the time. In fact, I don't know if some of y'all saw, there was like that leak with Fitbit data that showed folks that are in the United States Army, basically some of their data when leaked, you could kind of find where they were walking around big bases. So yeah, there's a lot of passive measurement to even transactional data. So for example, if there's a retailer program that you're a part of, if you're a frequent purchaser at, thinking off the top of my head, I do a lot of Sephora for makeup because quarantine, we have to buy all the colors. But all of these are other ways that we can collect data. So again, this movement from, what does not only the volume of data that we're collecting, but how we collect that data, moving from a very active kind of mechanism where the user understands to these passive ones, that's another way we can observe and think about data and issues related to it. And then just kind of the fundamental idea of data itself is shifting the ways in which humans interact. For example, if we think about human interactions through the internet, it's really interesting for me to think about the generation that is coming up now and how they became online. I can remember a time where I was not online. I did not have a cell phone until I think I was 20, because my father was like, "No, Mika, you're not going to get one." But in a way that human interaction itself is fundamentally changing because of the internet. I mean, we are doing it right now through this internet dialogue that we're having with Hopin. It's not only just the ways in which we're communicating and the speed at which we're doing it, but also the ability to do it in a way where we can co-opt and embody alter personas, or even in the ways in which we communicate. Communication itself is fundamentally changing. If we were to talk about cyberbullying and trolling, all of those are kind of examples, again, ways in which conversations itself, communication data itself is something to think about. And if we were to go with another example of how human interactions are changing in relation to data, think about automation. So there was a good example of a 2018 study conducted by the UC Berkeley Center and Labor Research and Education in conjunction with the Working Partnerships USA, which found that the trucking industry might be primed for a major labor crisis. According to this 2018 study, autonomous trucks could eliminate as many as 294,000 driving positions over the next 25 years. So, thinking about like how automation is changing human, not only the relationships between us, be it we now interact with a chatbot, or the ways in which we ourselves communicate, but also the ways in which our relationship to work and how we derive value from work is changing. All of that is generating new and new ways that we can understand how data informs the human experience. So the question about, bias in data or bias in technology, because I do tend to kind of use those interchangeably. When we evaluate the impact of data and its role in our technology, and I ask you what we're thinking about, I know that there's probably a few things you can pick up on. What's bias? What's impact? Maybe some of the thoughts you would have is bias talking about the language of right or wrong? Is it talking about our rights and responsibilities? Or is it talking about something else? I actually, when I think a bit about bias in data, I tend to think about more instead through this perspective of ethical technology. And if we were to provide a bit of a framework for what that means, I really like using this three-prong approach to thinking about bias in technology through bias in three different things. Bias in data, that is how data is generated, recorded, and shared. Bias in algorithms, that is how is artificial intelligence or machine learning and the robots interpreting data. Bias in practice, that is how it is devising responsible innovation and professional codes to guide emerging technologies, a thing that we should be doing or should not be doing. What kind of practices are we embedding into how we consume this data, how we build it into algorithms, how we monitor what these things do? So looking at this three-prong approach, which actually was developed by Floridi and Todeo in their 2016 publication, Philosophical Transactions, I think this gives us a very nice holistic bird's eye view of thinking about what does bias, because I'm going to argue that bias from data stems all the way down into all three of these. How does bias in data impact us? Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of this publication. It's the quintessential pop culture data science ethics read. And if you haven't read it, it is still highly topical. It is definitely one I would say is applicable to folks that are looking for something maybe from like the 2015 year forward to understand what some of the big concerns are in bias in data. But this Weapon of Math Destruction publication written by data scientists and activists very prominently argues about the impact of what big data is and how it is not neutral. Explicitly going so far as to say that when we think about what big data is, quoting Kathy O'Neill here, she says, big data processes codify the past. They do not invent the future. Doing that requires moral imagination, and that's only something that humans can provide. We have to explicitly embed better values into our algorithms, creating models that follow our ethical lead, and sometimes that means putting fairness ahead of profit. So in talking about what big data is, she goes so far as to say that big data is just the catalog of human experiences. If we were to create a piece of technology, and we'll go into an example looking at a financial instrument, if we're to create a piece of technology that's making a decision on something that impacts human life, the way it makes that decision is it's got to be fed some ground truth. It's got to be fed some reflection of understanding the problem space. And that's kind of this idea of where big data comes in. Big data is a reflection of data that is actively created by humans and then actively fed into algorithms and then actively automates away a decision from a human to a human by using a piece of tech to impact a human. Now, there's many folks who have been doing really, really great research around this. Kathy O'Neill, I think, does nice groundwork looking at various kind of things from the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was, again, in direct response to the 2012 housing crisis, 2009 to 2012, I should say, mortgage crisis, and the associated movements there looking at Wall Street and its role in that crisis, to looking at the impact on financial instruments and creation of credit scores to policing itself. So it's a very nice kind of survey. Some other folks who are doing research in this area, including Dr. Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression, which very specifically looks at how when humans are using search engines and how we ourselves, when we ask questions, we're making direct relationships between how we ask a question to the content then we discover through them. And so in understanding the creation of search engines itself as a human construct and reflection of the social landscape around us, Dr. Noble is able to really take a very intentional look at what it means when we build up a database off of flawed data sets. And then another publication, which I cannot speak enough about, from Dr. Ruha Benjamin, Race After Technology, really goes into a very kind of critical perspective of saying what happens when we assume that tech is neutral, when we assume that tech has the right to arbitrate and make decisions on human lives, but it is a neutral decision, what happens? And very specifically, as the title calls out, she looks at that through a intersectional lens, but particularly through a racial lens. Now, the landscape of, and I've kind of hinted that when I think about some of this technology and data, that ways we can look at this is through machine learning. The landscape of machine learning is very vast. We've got types of research we can talk about. So for example, that would be like classification or clustering algorithms. We could talk about tools that are used in this space. So Python as a programming language, or Julia as a programming language. We can talk about architectural concepts. We can talk about different specialized fields of sublearning. This is a very vast way to talk through the myriad of problems. But if we follow this framework of, again, that three-prong approach, starting with the ethics of data and how that data is generated, some ways we can begin to deconstruct the assumption that tech is neutral. We can start by asking the question, how can you better understand your data? So some of the ways that technologists have been looking at this has been actually starting to say, well, what kind of open source tools can we create that if we get a set of data presented to us, we're able to understand the intrinsic variance. Like, what is this thing made of? You know, when you're eating something, and I don't have a food product right here, but you know, if I go to the store and I buy clementines, there's going to be like a barcode on it. Well, in theory, I guess it depends where you're getting it. But in theory, when you buy a food product, it's got a food label item on it because that tells us how many calories, it tells us how much sugar or like carbs or, you know, trans fats, whatever. But the idea of thinking about how we answer this question, how can you better understand your data? Well, we should start by developing a standardized set of what kind of things we need to measure. And let's not only just do it in a way where we can have some mathematical analysis on it, but let's actually do it in a way where it's got a universal understanding. So there's folks that are thinking about developing standardized sets of stats, but not only standardized sets of stats to help us understand variance and bias in data sets, but also to communicate it in a way that's universally understandable. So this project is called the Data Nutrition Project that's coming out of the MIT Media Lab. Now, another project that kind of looks at this, but focuses again on drilling into what are kind of the stats that you need to think about is the Facets Project, which is a project that looks at helping you understand unexpected feature values, missing feature values, training and serving skew. So when we have problems that are being powered by machine learning, we have attributes that we feed in. We have characteristics of a problem that we say are things that need to be measured and understood. If there's something missing in that, or there's an overrepresentation of some of these characteristics or attributes, it can tilt the response of your prediction, let's say if it's a prediction model, one way or another. So the Facets Project is something that you can help that can help people explore their data set when they're actually starting early on to understand, well, where are we kind of before we start building, so we understand the lay of the land a bit better. With machine learning problems, some of the biggest struggle is actually collecting the data and actually making sure you have data that's actually representative. And in thinking about using tools that can help us get to that, Facets and the Media and the Nutrition Project out of the MIT Media Lab are good examples of ways that people can start kind of popping in a data set and exploring some of those things that are intrinsic within of what's missing, what is there, what isn't there in their data set. So moving from data collection and doing exploration up front to then thinking about the ethics of algorithms. How can we better understand the design of ethical algorithms? There is a few different algorithms out there that one can use when developing their machine learning model. And if we were thinking about the example of what I started with at the top of this talk about the example of that black box where we have the dashboard that generates a score 1 to 500, the higher that number being, meaning the more likely that person is violent. And that is supposed to be used by Chicago Police Department officers in how they respond to someone they may have pulled over or they're interacting with. That kind of idea of feeding output without being able to understand the input, that is a problem. So people have actually started to understand this as they've been doing more exploration and looking at tech products that make decisions on humans' lives. And one of the areas that have started to emerge has been this area of fair, accountable, transparent algorithms, which ask a different question. Back to Kathy O'Neill saying that if we're going to be building products that are meant to make decisions on human lives, her argument that we need to not maximize profit, that is, let's say dollars earned for selling a software service, taking a step back and saying, well, what is the thing we ought to optimize for? That's kind of what this field of research is getting into. So instead of saying, let's maximize profit for the sake of profit, but instead maximize something else, we can think about how then a different algorithm can help us optimize for that end goal. So a question that you might think about is how is it that we achieve fairness in a model? What does it look like to actually have representations of learning fairness in a given model? So some of the ways that you might try to think about having different measurements of fairness in your data might mean you might have different membership groups. So in giving kind of a little bit of an example, let me pop to the next slide, because this will actually break it up a little bit more. Oh, actually, no, I can talk about it here. If we were developing a financial instrument, such as, let's say, something that would be telling someone what the interest would be on a loan, rather than optimizing the profit of how much a bank would make if they give a higher interest rate, instead what could be generated is saying, okay, we can make a model that instead explores different membership populations. We want to have at least a certain percentage offered for each income threshold or for each membership cohort, and that could be a combination of different things, including maybe age, income, or what other socioeconomic factors are important in making recommendations for financial products. But in using an algorithm that, instead of saying we're trying to optimize for having the most profit at the end of the day, instead saying what we want to optimize for is having the same percentage of interest points recommended across our membership cohorts, that shifts the conversation a bit. Instead of saying that we're putting profit of a bank ahead of someone, we can instead try to say, well, if instead the intent is to try to offer someone a financial product, and we want to have a fair offering of that same interest point across all of our applicants, we can then start kind of change that question of how we build our algorithms to actually make recommendations and actually make classifications. So this area of research has quite a few different ways of thinking about what that is, but fundamentally it starts at the idea of asking that question differently. Instead of thinking about the thing that you want to maximize as being a business heuristic, is there a different set of heuristics that we can use to help us achieve the same end goal or a better end goal? Other ways that people have been thinking about this, so you might hear it as fair, accountable, transparent algorithms, but it's fair, accountable, transparent, ethical algorithms, so FATE. Other ways that folks also can think about this is they are spending some time actually even investing in understanding what it means mathematically to learn representations of fairness. So this paper here, this learning fair representations, if you get a bit more into, if you're curious about kind of the mathematical side of it, there are folks who are actually even going into that to say, like, what kind of mathematics do we need to bring to our algorithms to actually say that we are able to create a good proxy for what fairness means. So membership is definitely one way you can think about it. The question is definitely another way to think about it. And then this idea of using, of having reproducible mathematical representations of fairness itself, again, kind of getting back to, if you feed input in and you get different output out each time, that's a problem. So we need to be able to understand when we feed input in, how it is we get that output on the other side, and then reverse engineer. So this area of research has a very broad application set. And the slide I think I'm missing, I will put that back in, actually goes into a white paper from Berkeley that delves very specifically in this example of doing a financial instrument, the one that I was talking about, Bird's Eye, about saying rather than maximizing profit, it's about looking at different membership cohorts and how the end goal, while still trying to make, while still fundamentally selling a loan, let's say, is instead not trying to say, well, we want to do it just to make the most profit, but instead trying to change that question to say, well, across membership cohorts, we want people to have access to things, and we want them to be able to have them at this rate that we deem to be affordable. And what does affordable look like? So the white paper there also goes into a nice detail, and I will link back to that. I apologize. I don't know how that popped out of my slides. Now, moving then from data and how that data gets fed into algorithms to actually saying how we change the algorithms that we write ourselves. This all is nothing unless we actually think about investing in our practices. So the ethics of practice. How can we make our practices more intentional and deliberate? Now, I know probably quite a few people may have heard of this whole thing of bringing this idea of a Hippocratic oath into the technology space. If you haven't heard of this, okay, I'll give you a little bit of an overview. But the idea here is like the Hippocratic Oath, which is a oath that a medical practitioner takes, wherein they say that regardless of like the person being, let's say it's a violent offender, or regardless of who the person is, they take an oath to always try to save the person, because that is the oath of the medical practitioner. There's been dialogue of saying, can we bring some idea like this into technology? And if so, what does that look like? There's been a few folks who've been talking about this for a period of time, and there's been a lot of responses about how this may look. So we've had folks from the Association of Computing Machineries Committee talking about ethics and what an ethical code may look like, to Data for Democracy developing of this framework called FORTS: Fairness, Openness, Reliability, Trust, and Social Benefit, to other organizations, which that first link on the left-hand side actually goes through, I believe it's about 20 different organizations that kind of have their own perspectives on what an ethical code may look like. Now, the idea of an ethical code sounds squishy, it's very nice, and definitely I know can be met with the same critique of like, that's great, Lorena, but it doesn't do anything if there's no enforcement behind you. If there's nothing, if there's no teeth to it, what does this actually do? But I think what we can argue in thinking about practices is that we need to have a baseline where we as a collective say, if we are the technologists and we're creating the tools, what is it that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to? And then in moving from that accountability, we then have to bring that into the education space. So there's a lot of groups that are doing this, particularly the Mozilla Foundation. They have a lot of different opportunities of thinking about how to educate and think about practices with responsible computer science, responsible technology. This is an example of an ongoing grant right now that is currently, I believe, in the it'll be starting its second year of the 2-year grant program, where there's these different approaches to how to develop an ethics curriculum for folks that are studying computer science in undergraduate. Additionally, Mozilla not only looks at doing education about what responsible computer science looks like at the university level, but also they're doing quite a few other things. I just saw, I believe today or last night, that they have a grant out that is looking to fund looking to fund technologists who are activists, particularly Black activists, that are looking at the impact of tech on communities of color. Also activists who are doing a lot of data visualizations. So thinking about ways in which we can bring this dialogue to the center, it's not only educating those coming behind us, but it's educating ourselves. So be it from actually having investment of a fellowship to curriculum to oaths. We also now need to start thinking about, if we're going to own this conversation and think about what it means to be accountable, we also have to think about, on the other side, what it means to have enforcement. Now, there's a few ways that I've seen the enforcement conversation starting to develop, and I myself am I'm still working through what I feel about it. But there's been one dialogue that's been really interesting, has been thinking about developing like a food and development administration model for technology, where instead of saying, tech is neutral, instead it's saying, nah, you're on the hook for something. And maybe one way we can do this, former chief data scientist in the United States, I do not believe we currently have one, DJ Patil actually helped kind of get this kicked off in March 2018 or February 2018, and thinking about creating a clearinghouse for algorithms. That is, if you're writing an algorithm, it has to go through some public review, or it has to go through some clearinghouse so that it can understand, almost like you would write a white paper and present, this is what the intent of the model, this is the expectations of what it will do, this is expectations of challenges that we think may happen. Upfront presenting the bird's eye view of what the thing you're building is, and being able to have a plan for, hey, if something goes wrong, how can we back it up? So one way that folks have been talking about it is thinking about doing this FDA approach. So UK mathematician Hannah Fry was one of the folks that has been talking about this. Prominently, she wrote about it in her book, Hello World. Now, on the flip side, not someone doing enforcement on the side of saying, thinking about it maybe through the government lens, but someone thinking about it as a practitioner has been the Algorithmic Justice League. And wow, are they doing fantastic work. So Joy, who's the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, has been really prominent in her work demonstrating bias in facial recognition systems, where she first started looking and observing 1,000 faces, asking the recognition software to identify them by gender, where she found that there was an overbias in not being able to recognize women's faces, but more specifically in identifying darker skinned women's faces. So this work, which became her project Gender Shades and the cornerstone of her MIT thesis in 2018, actually led to her continued work talking about the use of facial recognition software in policing. And that brings us to right today, to this current moment. So this year, this last calendar year, broadly speaking, July 2019, where we start seeing that some of the work that folks like Joy and the Algorithmic Justice League, where they're actually demonstrating the limitations of products, of tech products, and the intrinsic harm that they have, and how tech is not being held accountable for the harm that is being brought about by their products. Now the government is starting to step in and listen, with mixed success, because where we are currently at with this dialogue is folks like IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft has said, yes, we will no longer offer our services to police enforcement, but only for a period of time or only until legislation is on the books. So this idea of changing our practices, it is starting to converge, but there is this idea of saying, what does enforcement look like? Who should be building the enforcement mechanism? And then how do ourselves as technologists feed back into that to make sure we're supporting this dialogue around having a sense of accountability? And all that to say that in changing all of our practices, the truth can never be more real than it is today, that so many more folks are getting into programming. And I think that is awesome. I look at Python, which is a language I have done so much work in. And this is an example of some of the shifting demographics in the Python space. So in 2017, Stack Overflow did this write-up talking about how Python had a 27% increase growth in interest based on their message boards. And they're like, why is Python growing so much? And, there was a lot of people talking about, oh, it's super easy to use, it's open source, and talking kind of about all of these things that didn't have to actually deal with the people themselves. And then the people that are using Python, then every year we have with the Python Software Foundation and JetBrains, a group that develops tooling for developers to write code in interactive developer environments. Other things that we see there, not only is it that, there's more people using Python for different things like data analysis and exploration, but it's quite literally because the population of people that are using Python is so much more folks outside of the United States and outside of Europe. The growth of programming and the people everyone who's coming online and who's becoming programmers today are largely from LATAM, are largely from Asia, are largely from Africa. In Brazil and Nigeria alone, it is profound. Nigeria has a population of, I think about like half of their population, if I remember correctly, is under the age of 25. Their growth is exponential with the number of people that are jumping 2 feet first into having careers in AI and ML research, be it researchers or practitioners. And those same stats, again, Brazil is a huge market that's growing in terms of who's driving innovation in technology. So practices, yes, it's important for us to think about enforcement and think about it in the hyper-local context, but so much more of this work is going to continue to be informed by a global population of people that has arguably the same shared values, but for folks that live in other parts of the world, we need to continue to engage in this dialogue to make sure that we're meeting one another meeting one another in that conversation with fair expectations of accountability. So the end goal, I would say, is namely that, you know, as much as I want people to say that technology is, you know, it's a great thing and does great things in the world, which I am very much here for. If there's one thing for everyone to take away today is for us to remember that technology is inherently political. This is a photo with some of the fantastic folks, the PyLadies, that is for women who program Python, that I got to meet at Python Brazil, and just the ways in which they approach programming and how it's such a game changer, and doing so many awesome things in Brazil, from, you know, data-driven journalism to civic tech to startup of really cool entrepreneurial spaces within Brazil. This is not unique to Brazil, and this is something that I think is awesome. And, you know, the thing that I'm continuously humbled by is everyone else seems to get it. Everyone else seems to understand that tech is inherently political. So I just am going to wrap up by saying, you know, as technologists, it is our duty to stay informed. That means educating ourselves on bias in tech. So bias in data, how is that data collected? To bias in algorithms, how we feed that data into the bias of our practices, which all culminates again from that data that we feed into our algorithms, that feeds into the ways in which we interact with one another and do the thing. It is fundamental for us to educate ourselves on bias in tech, as well as how tech impacts and amplifies issues of equity. The decisions we make in how we build and how we use tech can have a real negative or a positive impact. I've actually started a reading list that covers quite a lot of these topics. If anyone is interested in them, the link in the slides, it's just biasin.tech. Like I said, bias in data to me is the root of where we think about bias in technology, because I think at the end of the day, our products learn from data, and data is a reflection of the human world around us. So while it's great for us to educate ourselves, I'm going to argue it's not enough. We must continue to engage. We must continue to show up and do the work. There's quite a few places to have this conversation. Some I know are more hyperlocal, probably to my experience, but I do believe that for anyone who's interested in these conversations, there's quite a few folks that are thinking about this, from Black Lives Matters to the Algorithmic Justice League. And I can't help but think about this mural right here, which was around my house, installed during the events of June in Chicago, which had a lot of people power coming out to talk about issues of equity. This worldwide movement is taking a hold. This idea that tech is not neutral, that tech actually has a direct impact on the world around us. We are all living through a pandemic, and we are all living through a reawakening of what equity means in the here and now. Of those issues focusing on equity, I do believe racial equity is at the forefront of this movement. I believe is impossible for us to ignore. So while I see things like this walking around my neighborhood and seeing these public murals everywhere, I know I'm going to try to do my best to hold myself accountable and show up. And I hope that if any of you all would like to have that conversation with me and want to learn more about this, please reach out. All of us in doing the work that we do are going to be better technologists, and we're going to make better decisions and better products for the future. So that's a bit about why I think our data is biased and why I think we need to understand fairness, accountability, and transparency in technology. If people do have questions, I'm super happy to answer them. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and take the slides off and hang out and read your questions.
We have an applause. Can you hear the applause?
I heard like a little noise.
Hi. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Lorena. I'm improvising here. Could you hear the clap, the applause? Could you hear
Did you have like a recording?
Amazing.
All right. Well, people, this is the time for what I find to be the really key part, which is the conversation. So anybody who's ready to hop in, anybody who wants to join us with camera, you may do so. Remember, as you come in, please do manage your microphone. You're signaling, Lorena?
that people have to hit the button up there if they want to join in. There.
Looking, going like this, and I'm not really sure what's going on. Bienvenida, Betsy. Welcome, Betsy. Anybody who wants to join the conversation, you can use the chat for questions. I saw a couple of questions on the chat, which is going to be a good head start. As you come in, remember, please do mute yourselves, and then let us know that you're ready for a question. Loved your talk. Clap, clap, clap. Are you looking at the chat, Lorena?
Yes, I am.
Very, very, very good. Let me see. There's a poll going on also.
You all are like really on it. You're like, not only do we have this, but we have that, we have that, we have like stuff.
I have to go back to all these questions. Let me see.
I just showed up with
I'll start with a question, Lorena, while we get people on board.
Of course, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. I loved it. And I kept thinking during your talk, when people study computer science in college, that's what it's called. It's called computer science, right? And this idea that when you're in the medical community and you're about to publish a research, it has to be peer reviewed by other scientists, right? Before you gain the respect of the scientific community. About that, because it seems like the way that the medical community has done it is not so much just about the oath, but it's also about the peer pressure of having other colleagues look at your work and say, hey, this is great scientific research, or no, it's not ready to go to publication because I don't agree with X, Y, and Z or your methodology, right? So maybe there's some parallel there, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So I'm an editor for a journal called the Journal of Open Source Software, JOSS, JOSS.org. What's really cool about this journal, and I will keep my plug to a minimum, is, well, there's like very strong like Latinx representation in like the editors and all that, which is super cool. But what is really interesting about that whole peer review process, it all happens on GitHub, and we basically use like chat ops to do review. Chat ops kind of like a chat bot, right? Like you're like, publish paper, accept, reject. Like it's all transparent, it's all documented online, which is really cool. So I would argue that yes, there is spaces where when we think about the more scientific part of like what computer science is, that does have peer review. What I think is interesting has been this idea of, we got the term data science, and I always like to tell people I was doing data science before it was a Wikipedia term, and then if I say that to like young people, they're like, oh, how old are you? And I'm like, you don't ask that. But I think it's interesting because this idea of what does science here in that context mean? And I feel like data science itself is an umbrella term, which has all these different specialties underneath. And I think because this kind of like mix up and like hodgepodge of like what data science is now started to settle more in these subdisciplines, that yes, that I think within because now we actually teach data science in university. Like that wasn't like a degree you could get even like 5 years ago. That wasn't a thing. Like I don't have a degree in computer science. I have a degree in Latin American Latino studies. I have a degree in political science and mathematics, and that's it. but I think what you're speaking to though there, which is really interesting, is this idea of engaging the public and having these public dialogues about what does the impact of tech mean? Because we don't build tech we don't build them in these bubbles where they don't impact people. They impact everyone in the world around us. So maybe in the way like that the medical profession has done it, and I would love to do a talk on labor unions and technology, which I think would be utterly fascinating. But I think it's this idea of like putting the collective back into tech. What does that mean? How do we build core collective values? And I think maybe that's the learning we're taking from the medical field, is that medical unions are a huge thing. If you look at the rise of the medical industry, there's so much to be said about who they are, what their values are, and how they work, and they own that conversation. And I think now with tech, that is skilled labor. And if you think about skilled labor and the evolution of labor and what that looks like, we're now in this moment of reckoning of saying, who are we and what power do we have? Are we beholden to the powers that be, or do we have the power to walk if we don't want to do a thing? And I think that's where we currently are right now. And I think that I am so in love with Latinx technologists, because Latinx technologists are not afraid to call things out, which makes me so dang happy. Like everything that's happening there in like Puerto Rico, like you all are like inspiration. But people asking questions and having that sense of collective back in tech, I think that's maybe some of the lessons we're having, and getting back to the idea of the power of we. So I imagine there's maybe more to that conversation that that definitely we can get into. So yeah, long-winded answer, I know.
Let me pivot you to the other side of that question.
Yeah.
So Sophia's talking about like, you're almost talking about like a guild, right? Like the shoemakers guild, right? It's the community that peer reviews and keeps us ethical, right? But you also, in your presentation, you were talking about like an FDA for algorithms. Someone in the UK talking about that there needs to be some kind of a body that's able to not only set guidelines and practice and review, but also has the authority to like rein people in. As someone who has 6 data scientists working on our team, we tend to think of ourselves as, we'll be ethical ourselves,
Yeah.
We'll have the conversations. The idea of governance burden is kind of a scary thing. But how do you think people are like dealing with that idea of like, what is the role of government bodies in helping make sure there is this level algorithm playing field?
Yeah. So I would love to be like, it's complicated, it depends, which is sometimes what I say, because for me, I think the hyper local is very, very important. I do not think there's one size, like I don't think there's one size fits all, and I would argue that specific sectors will require heavier regulation, right? If you're working with sensitive data around like health, or if you're working around, I don't know, cryptocurrency, there's probably specific fields that require higher thresholds of regulation. So I guess maybe the way I would look at it is saying, as we kind of look at, like, if we had some idea, like some way where we could say, like, what are we automating away here, and what's the potential for harm? Can we think about, and I know that's not necessarily the best way to look at it, like risk mitigation, but I think we need to start kind of setting ourselves up with some type of framework around, if we had a clearinghouse in some way that said, like, upfront, you have to detail, how your product is going to make, like when your product makes decisions, like, the secret stuff that goes in. Yeah. Okay. It's your secret sauce, whatever. That whole proprietariness, I think that's where things get really scary, is if you just say, oh, this is proprietary, it's all the secret sauce, that's where everyone can just be like, oh, well, I'm just going to defer accountability completely. So I think I do believe that there's probably stepping stones to help us get there. And in some of the ways I would think about us as a collective body thinking about it, as maybe the practitioners, is thinking about like, what harm are we comfortable with when we put a product out in the world? What are we going to hold ourselves accountable to? And can we find some kind of baseline that, be it if it's defined within your sector, be it if it's defined within, your government, like your local government. I think we need to start with kind of those conversations, because I do believe hyperlocal informs some of that. And additionally, with also bandwidth of like what is possible. Because let's be real, you're never going to know how someone's potentially going to abuse your product. That's just the name of, like, people find the weirdest ways to like do things with things, like especially like products like Yo, when you literally can that was like a thing a while back. I don't even know how long ago that was, but the ways that people can use products is always just like wild to me, and we can't possibly know everything. But what I do think we can do is start thinking about, what harm are we comfortable with? How do we build mechanisms to